Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well. In this video, we start discussing a new topic called inventory control. Firstly, I will talk about inventory control subject to known demand. And after 2 weeks, I will also talk about inventory control subject to uncertain demand. Firstly, I would like you to introduce what I will talk about in this topic, inventory control subject to known demand. Firstly, I will classify the inventories, then explain why we hold inventory. Then we will go over characteristics of inventory systems and discuss the relevant cost in these inventory systems. I will introduce you the basic EOQ model, economic order quantity model to you. Then we will see the EOQ with finest production rate. Then we will discuss what would happen if there are quantity discounts. And then we will see resource constraint multiple product systems. And lastly, we will discuss EOQ models for production planning. Here is a graph showing the breakdown of the total investment in inventories in the US economy. This data belongs to 2007, but probably the situation is very similar also now. Here you can see that the highest investments in inventories belong to retail area, then manufacturing, wholesale, other areas, and then farm. And the total amount of investment is approximately $1.5 trillion. That accounts for between 20 and 25% of the total annual GNP. And from this result, you can easily see that to be able to control inventories intelligently, there is an enormous potential for improving the efficiency of the economy. Companies that use scientific inventory control methods have a significant competitive advantage in the marketplace. Now, these are the types of inventories: raw material, components, work in process, and lastly finished goods. Raw materials are the resources required in the production or processing activity of the firm. And secondly, components corresponds to items that have not yet reached completion in the production process. Components are sometimes referred to as sub-assemblies. You may think that a manufacturing company may not produce all the sub-assemblies by themselves. They may prefer to buy from outside. For example, think about an automobile company. There are different kinds of seats with different fabrics, etc. So they may prefer to, but instead of producing these seats, they may prefer to buy these seats from outside, and we call these as not raw material, as component. And what else? Also, firms can hold inventory for work in process. It is inventory either waiting in the system for processing or being processed. And in fact, the level of working in process inventory is often used as a measure of the efficiency of the production system. For example, in the just-in-time systems, the aim is to minimize this work in process inventory. And lastly, finished goods. Also known as end items, these are the final products of the production process. During production, value is added to the inventory at each level of the manufacturing. Now, I would like to talk about the motivation for holding inventories. In fact, I roughly spoke about that in aggregate production planning. and said that to cope with uncertainties, companies may prefer to hold inventory. But in fact, there are much more reasons for holding inventories. These are economies of scale, uncertainties, speculation, transportation, smoothing, logistics, and control cost. Now I will explain them one by one. Firstly, economies of scale. It could be more economical to produce a relatively large number of items in each production run and store them for future use. Why? Companies produce different type of products, and after producing a certain type of product, to be able to produce the new type of product, the company must reconfigure the production line and also recalibrate the machines. And as you would guess, the company must invest substantial time and money in these setups. So the companies prefer to produce enough number of products to justify this setup cost. I mean, when they produce in higher numbers or amounts, then they decrease the setup cost, but the inventory holding cost increases. So there should be a balance between this inventory holding cost and setup costs. Secondly, uncertainties. Uncertainty often plays an important role in motivating a company to store inventories. There are different uncertainties. Maybe the most important one is the uncertainty of external demand. For example, think about a retailer. A retailer stocks different items so that it can be responsive to customer preferences. If a customer requests an item that is not available immediately, it is likely that the customer will go elsewhere. Or the worst case, the customer may never return. So, to cope with this uncertainty or external demand, companies may store products. And secondly, uncertainty of the lead time. Let me explain what the lead time is. We can define it as the amount of time that elapses from the point that an order is placed until it arrives. In the production planning context, the lead time is the time required to produce the item. So, even though there is no uncertainty or external demand, even though it is exact, there may be uncertainty with the lead time. For that reason, it would be better to hold inventory. And there may be uncertainty of the supply. A company may not supply the raw materials or components from a supplier. Or maybe the government may put an embargo on certain products coming from different countries. For such cases, it would be better to hold inventory. And also, there may be uncertainty in the supply of labor, the price of resources, and the cost of capital. And to cope with all these uncertainties, the companies hold inventory. And the third motivation is speculation. In fact, when you hear the word speculation, you may think it as untrusting predictions. But the meaning is not like that here. It is used for if the value of an item or natural resource is expected to increase, it may be more economical to purchase large quantities at current prices and store the items for future use than to pay the higher prices at a future date. For example, silver is required for the production of photographic film. By correctly anticipating a major price increase in silver, a major producer of photographic films such as Kodak could purchase and store large quantities of silver in advance of the increase and realize the substantial savings. Now, transportation. In transit or pipeline inventories exist because we have positive transportation times. When transportation times are long, during all this transportation time, in fact, we hold inventory. Think about the case when transporting oil from the Middle East to the United States. In that case, the investment in pipeline inventories can be substantial. So, when we make overseas transportation, in fact, during all this transportation time, we hold inventory, and this increases our investment in inventories. For that reason, companies may prefer to establish their production operations domestically. And smoothing is another motivation for holding inventories. Think that there may be seasonality for the demand, and demand may change in the different periods. Think about the aggregate production planning strategies that we talked about. When we do not want to hold inventory and to cope with this changing demand, we should hire or fire workers in each period. But if we do not want to hire or fire workers, if we want a constant workforce plan, or if we want a smooth workforce, in that case, we should hold inventory. And logistics. There may be some constraints in purchasing, production, or distribution of items that force the system to maintain inventory. One such a case is an item that must be purchased in minimum quantities. For example, think that you are importing a raw material or a component for your production, and since you are importing, there may be a requirement to buy it at least one container. You may not need the amount in a container, but since because of this constraint, you have to buy it and you have to store it. Lastly, another motivation for holding inventories is control costs. These are the costs of maintaining the inventory control system. In fact, it is an important issue, but mostly it is overlooked. Think about an inventory system in which we keep the inventory to a bare minimum. In such a system, much more control is required when we compare with a system in which more inventory is carried. So, in the long run, a company may prefer to maintain large inventories of inexpensive items than to expend worker time to keep detailed records for these items, to be less costly in the end. Now I will start talking about the characteristics of inventory systems. Characteristics of demand is maybe the most significant factor determining the complexity of the resulting control model. Demand can be constant or variable. The simplest inventory models assume that the rate of demand is a constant. The economic order quantity model, EOQ model, and its extensions are based on these assumptions. However, variable demand also arises in a variety of contexts, including aggregate planning and materials requirement planning. Also, demands can be known or random, I mean uncertain or stochastic. But even though the demand is constant, it is also possible for it to be random. Virtually all stochastic demand models assume that average demand rate is constant. And secondly, lead time. In fact, I already defined lead time as if items are ordered from the outside. The lead time is defined as the amount of time that elapses from the instant that an order is placed until it arrives. But if items are produced internally, then we can interpret lead time as the amount of time required to produce a batch of items. And for the lead time, we will use the Greek letter tau. And it should be expressed in the same units of time as demand. I mean, if demand is expressed in units per year, then lead time should be expressed in years also. Review time is one of the characteristics of inventory systems. We can categorize review type into two categories as continuous review and periodic review. If the demand transactions are recorded as they occur, we call this case as continuous review. Think about a supermarket. When we do our shopping and come to the checkout stand, this checkout stand is in fact linked with the inventory database. And when we finish our shopping, then the inventory level is decreased by the amount of units that we buy. In the other case, I mean in the periodic review, inventory levels are known only at discrete points in time. Think about a classical small grocery store. In such a store, there may not be a barcode system. And maybe in the evening, the owner of the grocery store may check the inventory and determine the current level of on-hand inventory. And excess demand is also one of the characteristics of inventory systems. And it is important how the system reacts to excess demand. I mean the demand that cannot be filled immediately from stock. And mostly there are two assumptions. The excess demand is either backordered, I mean it can be satisfied at a future time, or it can be lost. It is generally satisfied from outside the system. But there may be other possibilities. What are these? One of these possibilities is partial backordering. I mean, part of the demand can be backordered and part of it can be lost. Or there may be customer impatience. I mean, if the customer's order is not filled within a fixed amount of time, he or she may cancel the order. The majority of the inventory models, especially the ones that are used in practice, assume full back ordering of excess demand. The last characteristics of inventory systems is the changing inventory. In some cases, the inventory may change over time, and this change may affect its utility. Think about food. You know, food packages mostly have an expire date. I mean, we see that this food is best before that date. So, in fact, those kinds of products have a limited shelf life. Besides these perishable items, also think about automobile spare parts. After a time, they may become obsolete. Or think about clothes. After a time, they may become out of fashion. In such cases, the mathematical models in fact incorporate the effects of perishability and obsolescence. They are quite complex. In this video, we will not consider this case, but of course, in your projects, if you are making a project about inventory control, you may need to incorporate these effects in your mathematical formulation. Now we will start talking about the cost. Our aim is to optimize the inventory system, so we should determine an appropriate optimization or performance criteria. Most of the inventory models use cost minimization as the optimization criteria. An alternative performance criteria might be profit maximization. In fact, cost minimization and profit maximization are essentially equivalent criteria for most inventory control problems. For that reason, in this video also we will use cost minimization as our performance criteria. Although different systems have different characteristics, all inventory costs can be placed into one of these three categories: holding cost, order cost, and penalty cost. Now we will discuss all these costs one by one. Now firstly I will talk about holding cost. We call holding cost as carrying cost or inventory cost. And holding cost is proportional to the amount of inventory physically on hand at any point in time. And the components of the holding cost include cost of providing physical space to store the items, taxes and insurances, breakage, spoilage, deterioration, and obsolescence cost. And besides all these costs, the most important cost is the cost of capital invested on inventories. You know, when we decrease our inventory level, in fact we increase our capital. And this capital can be investment by the company either internally, I mean in its own operations, or externally. Think about individuals. When individuals have capital, they place this capital in a bank and get an interest rate. This interest rate changes from time to time according to the economical situation of the country. However, companies must earn higher rates of return on their investments when compared to the individuals, because companies should remain profitable. And when companies do not make investment on inventories and make an alternative investment, we will call this return as the opportunity cost of alternative investment. And it is related to a number of standard accounting measures, including the internal rate of return, return on assets, and hurdle rate. I mean the minimum rate that would make an investment attractive to the firm. In fact, it is really difficult to determine this opportunity cost of alternative investments. And it is mostly determined by the accounting department of the companies. We will call this opportunity cost of alternative investment as cost of capital. Here is an example for a company. In this example, the cost of capital is given as 28%. It means that, think that if we have an item with a cost of $100, and if we think that this cost of capital is annually, then instead of holding an inventory of this item for a year, if we make an investment of $100 on an alternative investment, we know that we will earn $28. For that reason, we determine our cost of capital as 28%. Also, here we have taxes and insurances given as 2%. We have cost of storage 6%. We have breakage and spoilage as 1%. And we sum all these up and we obtain the total interest charge for holding inventory as 37%. Of course, this is an example. This percentage is not valid for all the companies, for all the products, etc. I mean, this percentages can change according to the company, according to the item. I mean, for example, think about frozen foods. To be able to store such foods, for example, for 1 year, you will need freezers or you will need special storage areas for these products. In that case, the cost of storage may increase. Or think about a very fragile item. In that case, maybe this percentage given for the breakage may increase. This is only a special example. This is not valid for all the items. And let C be the dollar value of 1 unit of inventory and I be the annual interest rate. Then H be the holding cost in terms of dollars per unit per year. Then we have such a relationship. H is equal to I multiplied with C. So we should be also be careful with the unit of the holding cost. Okay, here it is given as per unit per year. For example, if the item is valued as $180 and then according to this interest charge for the holding cost, we will obtain H as $66.6 for 1 year. If we have 300 of these items for 5 years, then the total holding cost over the 5 years would be approximately $100,000. Now, after this calculation, you may ask such a question. How can we know the inventory level for 5 years? I mean, the level of inventory changes from time to time. If we talk about finished goods inventory, when we use our inventory to supply the demand, then the inventory level will decrease. But when we make the production, then inventory level will increase. So, I mean, it is difficult to say that for 5 years we hold a constant level of inventory of 300. Probably we will have such a graph for our inventory. It may decrease and increase and decrease, etc. So the best way to obtain the average inventory level, if we call this function as IT, then we can take the integral of this function and calculate the area under this curve. And after calculating this area, we can divide that total area with T2 minus T1 and obtain the average inventory level. The second cost in inventory control systems is the order cost. The holding cost that we discussed is proportional to the amount of inventory on hand, and the order cost depends on the amount of inventory that is ordered or produced. And in most applications, the order cost has two components, a fixed and a variable component. We will call this fixed cost as K, and K is independent of the size of the order. In fact, we can think it as a setup cost to give an order. And the variable cost is C, and it is incurred on a per unit basis. And here is the formulation for the order cost. If the order quantity is 0, it is 0. If the order quantity is greater than 0, then we have an order cost of K plus Cx. And X is the number of the items that we order or produce. Here we can see the graph of order cost. As I mentioned, we have a fixed cost K. It is independent of the number of items that we order. And we have a unit cost C for each order, and it increases linearly as we increase the number of items that we order. And lastly, there is penalty cost. It is also known as the shortage cost or the stock out cost. And it is the cost of not having sufficient stock on hand to satisfy a demand when it occurs. When we cannot meet a demand, there are mainly two cases. In the first case, the demand can be backordered. I mean, when there is sufficient stock that we can meet the demand, or it can be lost, known as lost sales. In these two different cases, there are different penalty costs. In the backorder case, the penalty cost includes whatever bookkeeping or delay cost might be involved. In the lost sales case, it includes the lost profit that would have been made from the sale. And in either case, it would also include the loss of goodwill cost, that is a measure of customer satisfaction. Of course, in practice, it may be difficult to determine the loss of goodwill cost. We use the symbol P for penalty cost and assume that P is charged on a per unit basis. It doesn't depend on time, just like inventory holding cost. But in some cases, it may depend on time. For example, if a backorder results in stopping a production line because of the unavailability of a part, in that case, the duration, I mean the time that passes until the demand is supplied, is important. So in that case, the penalty cost may depend on time. Now I will introduce you a simple inventory control model. In this model, I will not consider the penalty cost, but I will include the first two costs that I discussed. I mean inventory holding cost and order cost. But later, I will also introduce you models that I also consider penalty cost. Many of the techniques that I will discuss, in fact, form the basis for commercial inventory control systems. In most cases, the models are simple, but they can find optimal operating policies even by hand. Also, they are often complex enough to capture the essential trade-offs in inventory management. Now I will introduce you the model economic order quantity, and I will call it shortly EOQ model. It is the simplest and most fundamental of all inventory models. It describes the important trade-off between fixed order cost and holding cost, and it is also the basis for the analysis of more complex systems. There are some assumptions in EOQ model. The first assumption is that the demand rate is known and it is constant. It is lambda units per unit time. This unit time can be days, weeks, months, etc. But we will mostly consider it as year. But of course, the analysis is valid for other time units as long as all the relevant variables are expressed in the same units. I mean, if I express my demands yearly, then I should also express the inventory holding cost yearly. Secondly, shortages are not permitted in the EOQ model, and there is no order lead time, but this assumption will be relaxed later. And there are three different costs. The first one is the K. It is the setup cost for each order. And the second one is C. It is the order cost per unit ordered. And lastly, there is a holding cost H. It is per unit held per unit time. Here in this graph, we see the changing inventory in the EOQ model. Assume that we are at time 0 and assume that our inventory level is 0. Since our inventory level is 0, we give an order with a quantity OQ. And since there is no lead time, the order immediately comes. At time 0, we have an inventory level OQ. And here in the EOQ model, we have a constant demand with lambda. And as you can see, the inventory level decreases linearly with the slope of minus lambda. And here, when we come here, again the inventory level is 0, and again we give an order, and immediately our inventory level increases to the amount Q. So, in the EOQ model, our aim is to find such a Q value that the total cost, total inventory holding cost and ordering cost is minimal. And here our aim is to find this optimal Q value. Let's calculate the total cost in the EOQ model. As I mentioned, we consider two different types of cost in the EOQ model: holding cost and order cost. Firstly, we know that our order cost has a setup cost as K plus variable cost multiplied with the amount of order. So to be able to find the order cost per unit time, we divide this cost with T. T is the time between two orders. And also we have an inventory holding cost, and we should multiply our inventory holding cost H with the average inventory level. In the EOQ model, we start with an inventory level of Q, and it decreases linearly until 0. So our average inventory level is Q over 2. You can also calculate this average inventory level like this. Here we have a triangle area. Let's calculate this area. It is Q multiplied with T divided by 2. And then we will divide this area with T to find the average inventory level per unit time. Then we obtain Q over 2. And we multiply this average inventory level with the holding cost and obtain our inventory holding cost. So this T, the time between orders, can be calculated by Q over lambda. And in the end, we have such a formulation for the total cost in the EOQ model. Here you can see that the inventory holding cost increases as the Q increases, and order cost decreases as Q increases. And you can notice that in the order cost, the variable cost is independent of the order amount Q. But this setup cost here you can see that is dependent on the amount of order, I mean Q. Here let's see these costs on the graph. Here this is the inventory holding cost H multiplied with Q divided by 2, and it is increasing linearly as Q increases. And this one K multiplied with lambda divided by Q is our order cost, and it is decreasing as Q increases. As you can see, there is a trade-off between the order cost and the inventory holding cost. So this one, GQ, is the function for the total cost. It is a convex function. To be able to show that it is a convex function, what we do is we take the first derivative of this function, and then we take the second derivative of this function. For any Q value greater than 0, we see that the second derivative is greater than 0, so we can say that it is a convex function. And in a convex function, to be able to find this minimum point, we can take the first derivative of it and make it equal to 0. And when we make it equal to 0 and find the Q value, we obtain such a function. Square root 2 multiplied with K multiplied with lambda divided by H. On this graph, you can also see an interesting result. Here you can see that the minimum of this function is equal to the point where our inventory holding cost is equal to our order cost. Okay. Now I will give you an example for the EOQ model. In this example, there is a bookstore at a campus, and this bookstore sells pencils. And there is a constant demand for these pencils as 60 per week. And the bookstore buys each pencil for with a cost of 2 cents and sell each of them for 15 cents. And it costs the bookstore $12 to initiate an order. I mean, it is the setup cost to give an order. And holding costs are based on an annual interest rate of 25%. Determine the optimal number of pencils for the bookstore to purchase and the time between placement of orders. What are the yearly holding and setup costs for this item? Now, in this question, the interest rate is given annually. So we can compute the holding cost annually. Now let's check the demand. Demand is given per week. So as I mentioned before, in the EOQ model, all the parameters should be in the same units. So firstly, let's convert this demand to yearly data. We know that the demand is 60 per week. So yearly demand is, we multiply 60 with 52 weeks and obtain that the yearly demand is 3,120. And now let's calculate the holding cost. It is given that the annual interest rate is 25%. And it is also given that each of the pencils cost 2 cents for the bookstore. So we multiply this annual interest rate with the cost of each pencil and see that the inventory holding cost for each pencil is $0.005 yearly. And let's substitute these into the EOQ model, and we obtain that the optimal order quantity is 3,870. The cycle time T is calculated by Q divided by lambda. So we see that cycle time is 1.24 years. And the average annual holding cost is H multiplied with Q divided 2, it is $9,675, and the average annual setup cost, that is K multiplied with lambda divided by Q, is equal to $9,675. As you can see, the annual holding cost is equal to average annual setup cost for the orders. So we know that in the EOQ model, at the optimal order quantity, these two costs are equal to each other. In the EOQ model, we assume that there is no lead time, but we can also include lead time in this EOQ model. For example, in the previous example, in the bookstore example, there is a lead time of 4 months. We can include this lead time into our model. The optimal order quantity will not change. It is again 3,870. But now we know that we have a lead time of 4 months. We want to determine the inventory level when we should give the order. Okay, we want to determine this level. Now lead time is 4 months. We should multiply this lead time with the demand, but demand is given yearly, so we should convert these 4 months into years. That is equal to 0.33 years. We multiply this with the demand rate and obtain 1040. This is the inventory level when we should give our order. So when there is a lead time, we will not wait until the inventory level is 0. So we will determine this reorder point, and at this point we should give our order. In this example, lead time is shorter than the cycle time. What I mean with the cycle time is the time between two orders. But there can be cases in which lead time can be longer than cycle time. Let me give you an example for this. For example, in this example, we have a EOQ value of 25. Our economic order quantity is 25, and our cycle time is 2.6 weeks, and our lead time is 6 weeks. Our lead time is longer than our cycle time. Here, as you can see, when we give an order here, our order arrives here. So in fact, we have to find the reorder point here. So we should find the length of this period. So first, what we do is to divide our lead time, that is 6, with our cycle time, that is 2.6, and we obtain 2.35. Here we have 2.31 cycles. Here we have 2 cycles, so here the length is 0.31 cycles. Also, we know that each cycle is 0.05 year. Here, to find this length, we multiply 0.31 with 0.05, and here we calculate the length of this duration in years, because the demand rate is given in years. It is 500, and we multiply this length with the demand and obtain approximately 8, and we see that our reorder point is 8. So when the inventory level is 8, we give the order, and we obtain this order after 2.31 cycles. And again, for example, when we are in this cycle, And when the inventory level is 8, again we give an order and we obtain that order 2.31 cycles later. And that's all that I would like to talk about in this video. In the next video, I will continue talking about the same topic, I mean deterministic inventory control. Thank you for listening to me. See you.